Hi, everyone. It is 3:30, so we will go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Communication Research Center's November Colloquium. My name is Michelle Amazine. I'm the director of the CRC and Associate Dean for Research at COM. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. Please silence your phones, your laptops, anything that beeps as we are recording this. If you are a COM student wishing to get SONA credit, be sure that you have checked in with our staff with your VU ID so that you can get credit. I'd also like to take a moment now to thank our staff. Amanda King is our research manager, and I believe there's Elena. Elena's back there as well. Thank you to both of you for helping out. You make this colloquium series happen. Today, our colloquium speaker is Dr. Chris Wells, who is an associate professor in emerging media studies and journalism, as well as COM's associate dean for faculty development. His program of research involves political communication with interests in public opinion, media systems, and computational methods. He holds a PhD in communication with a certificate in political communication from the University of Washington. Prior to attending graduate school, he worked in environmental politics. He continues to work on projects related to climate communication, such as VU's Climate Disinformation Initiative, Data and Misinformation in an Era of Sustainability and Climate Change Crises, which was jointly funded by the Institute for Global Sustainability and the Hariri Institute for Computing and Computational Science. Today, Dr. Wells will be sharing some of his ongoing political communication research with his talk, Social Class, Taste Cultures, Media Preferences, and Political Allegiance in the 2024 United States. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Wells.
Thank you. All right, so I'm sharing some work in progress. There's some conceptualization, some results, some discussion. Super open to your feedback and thoughts. So the area that we're looking at here has to do with social class. So perhaps to you, if you understand the reference, I guess it's a little bit faded, but this might be more for your parents' generation. Okay, but why are we talking about social class? So social class used to be an obsession in the social sciences, especially in sociology. It fell out of vogue a little bit from the 80s and 90s as some other interests came in, but the social class is back, and there's a few reasons for that. One of the really big ones is a growing awareness that people at different levels of what we sometimes refer to as socioeconomic status have very different life experiences and life outcomes. So we're probably most of us familiar with plots like this that show the growing inequality globally. This is in the New York Times. So what you're seeing here is per capita GDP, which is the third dark line right in the middle. Per capita GDP, gross domestic product, is the total amount of value that's created by an economy. And so that's roughly an average over the whole country of how much new value is being created at a given time. And so you can see that that line is steadily but very slowly going upwards. So there is growth in our economy as new businesses are formed and new jobs are created and that sort of thing. But what you can very quickly see is that new income is almost entirely going to the richest people in the country. So this is the top 0.01%. That's how much of the value they're taking from the growth in the economy. Whereas this line here is the middle 40%. So this isn't even people who are below the average. This is literally the middle 40%, what we would call the middle class. So they're falling behind even the per capita GDP. And then of course the bottom 50%, so this is everybody who's below the midpoint in terms of wealth, is well below that. And obviously this has been changing over time. So 40 years ago, things were pretty different. If you go back farther than this, there was even more growth inequality that happened in the United States and the industrialized West after the Second World War until the 1970s and 1980s. So this is a big change in the way that money is distributed, which may result in very different life experiences for people at different income levels, as well as those who are having different kinds of experiences. Let me show you a couple of those before we get to the communication story. It has recently been, well, not that recent, a few years ago, it was noticed that sections of the United States population are actually losing life expectancy. So a few years ago, for the first time, parts of the United States actually started dying at earlier ages than their parents had been, which was, again, new throughout the 20th century. We had growth in medical care and preventive care and all those kinds of things. But as you can see here, this is among men. For those in the lowest income, if you were born in 1930, you actually had a higher life expectancy than their sons born in 1960. So our life expectancy has actually slipped for the poorest citizens. It's grown quite a lot for the richest citizens. So there are real material outcomes of what we saw a moment ago with the income inequality. We can paint this picture a little further and talk about more about the different experiences that different income groups have. So we have learned a lot about, we've seen a lot of what's called deaths of despair in the last 20 years. These are deaths that are attributable usually to suicide, alcoholism, or drug abuse. These are deaths of despair. They have grown greatly. They've grown almost completely among those people who did not attend college. So a really huge dividing line in our country is those people who go to college and get a 4-year degree, to a lesser extent a 2-year degree, and those who don't. When we talk about the death of despair, that is happening among a particular group of people. Again, the bottom section of the socioeconomic ladder. There's a number of different ways that this has been detailed, but there are material changes in the experiences of daily life to folks. We've talked about economic prospects, whether you can go to college, the outcomes of going to college, family stability, your likelihood of divorcing, your likelihood if you're a child of growing up in a family without 2 parents, super predictive by the wealth of your family. Your health, we saw one instance of health, other measures of health, chronic conditions, chronic diseases, those kinds of things. All of these have become compounded with growing inequality. So this is one reason why there's a return to interest in social class in the United Kingdom, in Europe, in the United States, and other places. Let's now pair that with another set of shifts that we're seeing that are closer to my area of focus, which is political communication. And there we are seeing significant changes in political alignments. And we will see these in a second. We'll see them specific to the 2024 election. But there's a few things that are happening. So this is Democratic vote share by income group. So these are the poorest citizens. These are the richest citizens. In 2008, so the earliest series in this data, you can see that the Democrats got a lot more of their support from poor folks, some from kind of the working middle income, and a smaller portion from older groups, from more rich groups, wealthier groups. That steadily shifted between 2008 and 2020, and it's probably 2024 was probably similar to 2020. You can see Democrats are getting growing shares of their support from the very wealthy, and their support from the poor is basically falling down to, I guess it's here in 2020. So you have this U shape, first of all, where less of their support comes from the middle class, but you're also having this shift where it's moving from the poor supporting Democrats to the rich supporting Democrats. And if you're familiar with American political history, this is a huge shift. 60 years ago, the Democrats were the party of the poor and the working folks. So they were before the 1960s, they were the party of poor farmers in the South, poor farmers in the Midwest, and working people in industrialized cities all across the country, people who were in unions. That was the party of Democrats. So we're seeing a 180-degree shift currently in political allegiance. But income isn't the whole story. So let's talk a little more about this. We're seeing something similar with education, especially when it comes to very advanced education. This, again, is support for different parties among those with high school education or less, college degree or advanced degree, basically any master's degree or more. And then within each chart, we're seeing the change over time. So those who have a high school diploma or less are supporting Democrats less and less and less over time, right? The story is a little bit more mixed for those with a college degree, but this line is continuing to trend upward this year. So college degree is becoming the dividing line between the parties, actually to a much stronger degree than income is. And you see for advanced degree, since the 80s and 90s, that has taken off. So it's a huge amount of support from the very educated. That's a plot that tracks all the way to 2024. So here you can see that growing support among people with a college degree for Democrats and the growing support among those with less than a college degree for Republicans. So the real dividing line seems to be not exactly income, but education, which is another important component for social class. Now, we should mention for a moment here race and gender. For the last several electoral cycles, non-white citizens have been strong supporters of Democrats. In fact, Democrats have relied to a significant degree on their solid support among non-white citizens to be able to compete with the Republicans who are regularly getting 55 to 60% of the white vote. But that's changing. Comparing Biden in 2020 with Harris in 2024, so these are exit polls, they're fresh and not completely fully analyzed, but this is what the trends are. What we actually saw in 2024 was that gaps in partisan support by race and gender actually shrank. So this is, race especially is now less of an issue than it was in the last two electoral cycles. This is because white citizens stayed basically in the same place. Non-white groups moved significantly toward Trump. Latino men were the biggest story, moving a 43-point swing in 4 years, which is an almost unheard of shift toward Trump, with this demographic group ultimately going for Trump. White women, on the other hand, moved slightly toward Harris, driven by college-educated white women in line with what we just saw, but still supported Trump overall. And white men, as I said before, basically stayed the same. So what all of this is saying is that there is something other than race that seems to be playing a very large role in people's political decision-making. And there is something about education in particular, and in a complex way, income that is continuing to shape the way that people see the political world. So trying to get at that is kind of the purpose of what I'm going to get into in a second. So all of this is the background. Last thing I want to mention, we're seeing some strange intersections of income and education in the public opinion data. Matt Grossman and David Hopkins call this the diploma divide. As I mentioned before, whereas income used to be the best predictor of presidential vote, you could predict it with reasonable accuracy because the Republicans are the party of the rich and Democrats the party of the poor. Now it's essentially education, as we just saw before. Having a college degree is now a great predictor. In fact, this is quite a complex intersection because those of high education and low income are the most reliable Democratic voters now. So these, if you think about it, these are educators. So secondary school educators, for example, in Massachusetts, you need a master's degree to teach in a public school. Those folks aren't paid a lot, but they have a fairly high degree of education, being in the graduate degree category. On the other hand, those with low education, people who maybe didn't finish college, they've got an associate's degree, but they make a lot of money, are the most reliably Republican demographic, which is interesting. And this cuts across the different races to a large degree. So in the second category, just to put an idea around it, if you think about people who work in the trades, people who own plumbing businesses, people who own construction businesses, a lot of those people don't have a college degree. They might have an associate's degree. They very likely have a trade degree, something like that. They may also have inherited a family business. So if they've inherited the plumbing business from their father, they may have inherited that capital. So it is very possible in the United States to have a relatively high income without a college degree. Politically, those people are becoming more and more strongly aligned with the Republican Party. Okay. Next step. Going back to the study of social class that I mentioned a little bit earlier, class was long understood in terms of kind of purely economic variables. How much money did you have? How much money did you make? How much money did you inherit from your parents? And what was your occupation? So if you go back to early class analyses, for example, in the Great Britain, they're separating classes according to this. So there's the leisure class, people who are super rich and never do any work because they just inherited all their money and they actually thought it was offensive to work. So they just lived off inheritance. Then you had kind of like a wealthy middle class who was looked down on by the rich people because they had to work for a living, but they made decent money as a lawyer or a business person or whatever like that. Down through a couple more classes to the much vaunted working class, people who often did manual labor. They worked in mines, worked in manufacturing, transportation, those kinds of things. So this was the old model of social class. But Mike Savage in the UK has been the leader of this. People are pointing out that continuing to use those kinds of measures, even using those measures alongside education, miss a great deal about different kinds of experiences that people at different locations within the socioeconomic system experience. And so we are part of a few research programs that are trying to better understand how we can understand the landscape of experiences in terms of not only income and education, but also people's actual day-to-day life experiences, how much they're challenged to put food on the table for their family, how far they have to commute to work, taking time away from their family, what sorts of health concerns they have, and so on. So I'm going to be able to just give you a little bit of a taste of what we're looking at. And this overview is going to be focused on political dispositions and media consumption. So that's what I'm focused on right now, but we're also concerned with these other aspects of experience, and especially how those other pieces of experience shape people's interpretation of media and politics. So in the last election, we saw that inflation and perceptions of inflation and perceptions of economic struggle played a very large role in the choice that people made at the ballot box. So we as scholars need to understand better what made that happen? What sorts of people were put in the kind of position where they thought that was the most important thing in an election? And what kinds of media experiences shaped their interpretation of the world so that it led them to the political choice they made? We okay? Okay. So now you won't be, because we're going to talk about French theory. Okay, so let's take, we're going to take a very brief look at Pierre Bourdieu and his analysis of social class. So Pierre Bourdieu is sometimes cited as the most cited sociologist kind of all time or something like that. He had some very insightful ideas about social class, and I want to briefly talk about a couple of them to make some sense of our analysis. For Bourdieu, society is a competition for power. All of us are engaged on a day-to-day basis in a competition for power. We're trying to get little bits of status out of the different things that we do, all the different things that we do. So we go to school to get a degree and also to meet people, to network. We put on clothes, we put on a costume that's going to position ourselves in a certain way in society that we hope will gain us various kinds of advantages. Bourdieu has a fascinating backstory, history that makes sense of some of his obsessions. He came from a poor part of rural France. He was an awesome student, went to Paris, but all the rich French kids in Paris looked down on him and thought that he was sort of, how could he know anything? He was from this provincial town, very French type of problem. So he had great insights into these issues. He also pointed out, going back to the point I made earlier, that money is one very important resource, but it's not the only one. It's not the only one that we can get a hold of, and it's not the only resource that we use to create class exclusion. It's not the only one that we use to create a distance between ourselves and others who we don't want to be in our group. Specifically, Bourdieu outlined three types of capital. He said there is economic capital, that's money. And so if you have more wealth, either because you earn it or because you inherited it, you can do a lot of things with that, including get the other kinds of capital, which is very useful. But anyway, that one we're familiar with, so I'm not going to tell you too much about that. The second type of capital Bourdieu talked about was what he called cultural capital. So cultural capital is not the same as money. Instead, cultural capital is your savoir-faire, if you will, to use the French, right? You're kind of knowing what is supposed to happen in society, especially knowing what is supposed to happen in elite society. So what are the right clothes that you wear to a fancy dinner in Paris, right? How do you drop references to elite forms of art and music? How do you know the latest things that are happening in the avant-garde art world? Those kinds of things. That's cultural capital. And Bourdieu pointed out it's very unevenly distributed. You're a lot more likely to have access to cultural capital if your parents brought you up with cultural capital, if they had the money to send you on horseback riding lessons where you could learn the proper form for horseback riding, and then you could show it off to your friends and so on. So this is cultural capital, having kind of access to the refinement is also often a word that's used. That's cultural capital. And the third capital is social capital. For Bourdieu, this is essentially network capital. It's what is the set of people that you know? Are you in touch with people in the higher echelons of society? Are you friends with them? Can you mix with them, and so on? Or is your social group a different group from that society? So Bourdieu made some fascinating insights about 1960s, 1970s French society. That was a very hierarchical society in which there was kind of one dimension of cultural capital. There were the refined arts and cultural artifacts, and then there was the popular cultural artifacts. I'll show you an example of that in a second. But anyway, for Bourdieu, all of this meant that your cultural capital can take these different forms of your knowledge, your taste for fine wine and so on, your ability to display yourself properly. So he interpreted taste as an expression of a person's class position. You're showing who you are. You're showing that you're part of the elite class. And it also is used to maintain boundaries between the elite class. If you don't know what an elite piece of music is, you've never heard it before, you don't recognize it, you are showing that you're a rube, like a country person in French 1960s thought. I just said this. So refined tastes require education and money. And so all of this adds up for Bourdieu to a process of social reproduction. So it's not that we're thrown randomly as citizens into this social process. We grow up in a particular one, and it's quite difficult to move because you're going to grow up in southern France with a provincial accent. You're going to sound like the hillbilly when you go to Paris and you try to enter a sociology graduate program. In that way, for the most part, society is reproduced and the class strata continue from one generation to the next. I'm actually, sorry, I'm going to skip this one. We can go back to Bourdieu if people are interested, but I'm going to save the time. So let's move to now and what we're trying to study. So we're looking at tastes and experiences in the United States through this kind of Bourdieusian lens, all right? So we're asking first, how are tastes and experiences distributed across American society? Given what we just saw about widening gaps in terms of income, the outcomes of those gaps in terms of health and well-being and family stability, as well as some of the outcomes in political dynamics. Second, more specifically, can we detect that clusters of taste and experience constitute distinct social classes? Can we reconstruct, given the changes that have taken place in society, can we reconstruct the American social landscape in terms of clusters of these tastes and experiences? And then finally, I'll look at how individuals' class positions relate to the set of media that they're exposed to. All right, so that's where we're going. Any questions? Are we okay? All right, cool. Here's our main method. And if you thought French theory was crazy, you should check out French statistics. So this is Jean-Paul Benzaicry, who worked with Bourdieu to create what's called multiple correspondence analysis. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that method. So correspondence analysis is essentially a principal components analysis for categorical instead of continuous data. What that means is that it's a dimension reduction technique. It means you can take a whole bunch of variables, and correspondence analysis will help you detect underlying dimensions that explain similarities and differences among your categorical variables. To give you an example, people who like gourmet coffee also maybe tend to like hybrid cars. If that is indeed the case in your data, correspondence analysis can help you identify an underlying dimension that explains both of these tastes. Does that make sense? So there might be an underlying dimension. In American society, we might call it liberalness. Others might call it refinement or progressiveness. Anyway, that would be kind of a name we might give to that underlying dimension. So this is what dimension reduction is. There's lots of different tools for this, principal components analysis. correspondence analysis. I'll mention another one later, which is a class type of factor analysis. Anyway, that's the basic method that happens here. This allows us to summarize across a lot of different tastes and experiences that we might have in our data, which I'll show you in just a second, to try to figure out what is the underlying structure that is leading people to have clusters of these tastes. So for example, people who like gourmet coffee and also like fine dining and also like hybrid cars. Is there something underlying that groups those people and those tastes together? That's the idea of correspondence analysis. And that's what I'll show you in just a second. So our data is this is 2020. This is the last election, just before the last election. We've got about 6,500 respondents from Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, which might be familiar from red spots on a recent electoral map. So these are swing states politically. And we have a variety of question batteries. Most of all, I'm going to be showing you 15 items that are related to cultural tastes. Talk more about that in a second. And then I think it's actually more than 24 items that relate to media use. And then a bunch of like all the typical demographics and then some. This is kind of like on steroids, a bunch of stuff. All right, so I'm going to show you a plot, a two-dimensional plot of our correspondence analysis. There's a few different techniques we can talk about in more detail, but anyway, we ran a multiple correspondence analysis with a solution for 4 dimensions. So I'm going to show you 2 dimensions at a time, but you're talking about like 2-dimensional space, 3-dimensional space, and then there's a 4th dimension, which mathematically makes sense, but we only have 3 dimensions of space. So anyway, here are the first 2 dimensions of our plot, and I'll show you a couple of things from this. First of all, the horizontal dimension is the first dimension. That means that this is the principal component that accounted for the most variance in the data. It's the most useful for explaining why we see different tastes grouping together. So that's across here. So that means that anything over here on the far right is related to one another on that dimension. Anything on the far left is related to each other on that dimension, and those are very far apart. The second dimension, the vertical dimension, is dimension 2, and same thing. This is a separate dimension from the first dimension. Then you can see that the first dimension accounts for about 13% of the variance in the data, and the second dimension about 9%. Okay, so what are we seeing here? Well, these are the taste variables that we entered into the data. So we asked people, do you like pickups? Do you like fishing? Do you like listening to sports on the radio? Do you like going to art galleries? Do you like foreign travel? And so on. Now, all of those ones with a 1 means they said yes. So anywhere you see a 1, that means they did like it. You'll notice all the zeros are kind of clustered over here in a not very interesting way. That's kind of typical of correspondence analysis. Usually that doesn't tell us very much. So we're going to focus on the ones with the little ones beside them. Okay, so then we go about interpreting this. If we look, funny sound. Okay, if we look down here, we can see that foreign travel, art galleries, classical music, those group together on kind of on both dimensions, especially on dimension 2, a bit on dimension 1. So we're kind of seeing some kind of cluster there. Opposite them on dimension 2 are people who like NASCAR, people who like the National Enquirer, people who like pickups. Okay, so let me just tell you our interpretation of these. So the first dimension is actually something that you may not have thought of. The first dimension is just, do people enjoy a lot of things? And do they engage with a lot of cultural activities of any type? So on the right, people who are high in dimension 1, they're like, yeah, I'm into stuff. I'm into hybrids, I'm into National Enquirer, art galleries, and all those folks are high on dimension 1. Opposite them are people who won't say they like anything. They don't engage in any of these kind of cultural activities. Dimension 2, on the other hand, looks a lot like partisanship. We have down here kind of foreign travel art guys, kind of democratic-looking things. And then at the top, we have pickups, radio sports, now kind of classically conservative things. And in fact, if we overlay on here, and I've removed the zeros now, but if we overlay income and partisanship, which were not used in the allotment of the space, you can see that income, I think I've got it right here, income runs like this. So the very poor are here. They don't have the resources for a lot of fancy tastes. And then income increases as you go like this. And then interestingly, between the two highest levels of income, it takes a sharp jag south into democratic territory, right? Similarly, if you look at partisanship, partisanship is basically a straight line. Partisanship is perfectly aligned with that second dimension. So you have strong Republicans here, strong Democrats there, and basically the others in between. So the first two dimensions are relatively interpretable, being total cultural engagement and partisanship. We have two other dimensions, dimensions 3 and 4. I'm going to save time not looking at these to give you a little more detail about what we've done with classes, but we can go back to this in questions if people are interested. Okay, so well, actually, I'll tell you about them right here. So we identified 4 dimensions. The first 2 that I just mentioned to you, involvement and partisanship. The third dimension is, interestingly, is division between consuming any political media. So partisanship of the political media is undifferentiated in this dimension. If you consume any of it, you're high. On the other hand, the opposite end is outdoor activities. So this is people who go fishing, people who like pickup trucks, that stuff. And then fourth is consumption of a lot of television. So people who like soap operas are off the charts on this dimension, and everybody else is on the other side. So these are the 4 dimensions that our model found were most significant in shaping the tastes and habits of this group. What we next did was we used a latent class analysis to group together the respondents in our survey based on their positions on the 4 dimensions plus their income. So those 5 variables offered the substance to create 8 emergent classes that we identified within the data. So these are the 8 classes of people that we have identified, such that their tastes tend to align, so that within a group, people tend to have similar tastes. And these are the groups. First, we identified a group that we called the young professionals. These have medium to high income. They tend to have very high education, and they're distinctly young. They have a peak around 40 years old, and then kind of a bell curve, actually a sharp bell curve around that, suggesting that these are professionals in the prime of their working age. We'll see more in just a second about some of the habits of each of these groups. Group number 2, and the numbers are arbitrary, these are just categorical groups. The group number 2 are less employed, and they are at the far left of that first chart. They are totally low involvement. So these folks, some of them are retired, many of them are unemployed, some of them are disabled. These are folks who don't work and don't have a lot of resources. They lean Democratic. Group 3 are rural, white, low income individuals, and they lean strongly Republican. Group 4 are kind of a mirror image in urban areas. They're much more diverse. In Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, they're still strongly majority white, but they're more diverse, and they lean Democratic about as much, not quite as much as the rural folks lean Republican. Group 5, we're still analyzing. Group 6 are these high education, high income groups, and these are the strongest Democrats in our sample. And 8 are kind of a parallel to this group. They're not quite as high income, not quite as high education, reflecting what I said earlier, but they have high incomes and they lean Republican. So let's look at each of these groups across some of our key variables. So first, I told you a bit about these folks in terms of partisanship. Those are the high income Democrats, group 6 that I mentioned before, and they are just about the most Democratic of all of our groups. That urban low income group are also Democratic, the low involved are slightly Democratic. The other groups tend Republican, or I should say the other classes. Income, interestingly, the 3 groups with high income are the high income Republicans, which I mentioned, the high income Democrats, who are also high education. They tend to have jobs in nonprofits, in research, in architecture, that kind of stuff. And then the young professionals also with higher income. Well, watch this. With education, those Democrats are just off the chart, right? The class of young professionals also have very high education, but the high income Democrats are really the urban and suburban educated elite liberal class. That's where they are right there. Interestingly, the high-income Republicans, in line with what we talked about earlier, much lower income overall. There's a greater mix of income, of education of these groups. A good number of them don't have college degrees, whereas you can see, especially from the tiny error bars on high-income Democrats, that's a group that has almost entirely graduate and college degrees. So a big divide there. Okay, and now getting to news consumption and media consumption. If we look first at liberal news, so this is the New York Times, Washington Post, what else did I put in there? Huffington Post, a couple of other digital outlets. Interestingly, although high-income Democrats are high, they're not as high as the young professionals. What we're going to see again and again is the young professionals stand out for consuming a gigantic amount of political news of every type. They really stand out in that way. So even the high-income Democrats, who you might expect to be kind of liberal news hounds, are not quite as high. All the other groups, very low. So already we're kind of at the lower end of the scale here. You get a little bit from the urban low-income group and a bit from the high-income Republicans, but overall low levels of liberal news. When it comes to conservative news, even lower. So the young professionals stand out for consuming more conservative news, as they do for all types of news, but all the other groups much less. The surprising one might be here. If you think that rural folks are sitting around in their trailers all the time watching Fox News, not really. They're not a significant watcher of conservative news. They actually watch less than the high-income Democrats, right? And this is not just conservative news. This is Fox News, One American News Network, and the Daily Caller. So this is pretty right-wing news, and that's where it's coming from. Finally, and I think you might enjoy this, we have everybody's buddy, Joe Rogan. So this is the percent who listen to Joe Rogan at least rarely. The numbers are obviously really low, except when you get to the young professionals. So that is, we've seen that in this election, actually. This is, especially in this election, this was young men, young middle class, even upper middle class, lower middle class men who really were tuned into Joe Rogan. So where we're at, we think we have a framework that can detect different kinds of experiences that people have, at least according to this hybrid framework of both what are essentially demographic variables like education and income, but combined with people's expressed interests and experiences with different facets of life. So it's not only education and income from before. I think we have some face validity that the differences that we've identified within the classes are meaningful in terms of political communication. We're successfully detecting large differences actually in both people's location within the social structure in terms of income and education, but also their choices about what sorts of news to consume, at least within the kind of political news landscape. And then we're quite pleased with this finding because Joe Rogan's audience is enormous, but at least in 2020, it was somewhat selective. It was a heavily male audience. It was a very young audience. Older people weren't listening to Joe Rogan, and he was a little bit difficult to detect in surveys. So trying to get our minds around his impacts was a little bit difficult. But we're pleased that the combination of correspondence analysis and latent class analysis has delivered a class that really has concentrated together Joe Rogan's audience. And again, Joe Rogan wasn't used in the plotting of the correspondence analysis map. So I'll stop there. We got some time for questions. Thanks for your attention.
So the media ecosystem, the news ecosystem especially, is evolving, it's fracturing.
Mm-hmm.
People are becoming more and more distrustful of legacy news outlets. What does that mean for what you're trying to do?
Yeah, so one answer would be So we have some trust items actually that we're working through to understand how trust is unevenly distributed across these groups. So we suspect that some of these groups are going to be especially distrustful. And then you get into the interesting question of people who consume news they don't trust and people who don't consume news even though they do trust it, right? So we're going to get an interesting kind of four-part typology there that we're interested in exploring. As far as the fragmenting of the landscape, though, I'll go back to that last plot. I went too far. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so while it's true that the media landscape is fragmenting, when you look at audience distribution across news consumption, it looks much less fragmented because there's such an enormous divide between people who consume no news at all and those who consume any. So this is really illustrated by our third dimension. So the tastes that score high on that third dimension are Daily Caller, One American News Network, so right wing, right, solidly right wing. Also Joe Rogan, but also NPR is right there. Breitbart is there, Politico is there, Fox News is there, the Wall Street Journal is there, and you can't see them, but both New York Times and Washington Post are right there. So they're sitting right next to each other on the same dimension. So Krupnikov and Ryan talk a bit about this in their book, that we should not overlook the divide, which is actually larger than the partisan divide, which is people who are totally uninvolved in politics and don't consume political information, and those who do, because there's a surprising amount of overlap over here.
What book is that?
It's Krupnikov and Ryan, The Other Divide. Yeah, that's what it's called. Yeah, and yeah, they argue that we're very concerned about the partisan divide, which we should be, but in numeric terms, there's a lot of people who are just avoiding the news altogether. Did you hear the story that was circulating on election day, that one of the trending searches was, did Joe Biden drop out? So whether somebody arrived at the ballot box and was surprised not to see Joe Biden on the ballot or something else. I looked into it a little bit, and it does rise, that search does rise on election day, but compared to other relevant searches, it was a bit blown out of proportion. But there's a lot of people who are not consuming much political information. Yeah. How do we choose the 15? Yeah, so we chose those on the basis of past research. So there's a great book by Mark Hetherington, I can't remember his co-author, called Prius or Pickup. And in it, they talk about kind of some of their ideas about, they don't have nearly this richness of data, if I may say so. But they talk about some of the divisions in society, and that gave us a couple of those. And then there were a few other studies that gave us some of those. And then if we were to go back to Bourdieu, we would get more things like fine dining, knowing what types of food go together, knowing who composed certain pieces of classical music. These are Bourdieusian, those were his actual measures. And we were trying to adapt those to what would make sense and what would we at least get a handful of respondents to say yes to in our survey. Uh-huh. Yeah, so the respondents are very representative of the states, within the states. So we had quota sampling through a survey research firm, so it was pegged to census parameters. So very representative of those states. We chose those states for two reasons. One is that I have been working with colleagues from Wisconsin on the study, so we have grants that are focused on Wisconsin. And then we actually had Michigan, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina because we were looking at swing states in 2020. But for this study, I chose these three states because they're the most similar. All of them are Midwestern, overwhelmingly white, Rust Belt, post-industrial states. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I think we will get a lot of similar results. So a lot of the classes will be the same. We've tested this a number of different ways, and you get kind of reflections of the same basic class structure either way. But there's groups that we just don't have many of. Obviously, we don't have Southerners, which is a different type of group. We don't have California, which by itself, so yeah, things would change. We probably have, like I said, we're overwhelmingly white. So parts of the country that aren't as white, we would probably see different kind of mixes of media uses and tastes and so on. Yeah. Yes. Uh-huh. No, no natural language processing. No, it's just survey data in which we have responses from every respondent on those questions. So do you like pickup trucks? Yes or no. Do you like hybrids? Yes or no. And then some of them, like income, people gave multiple responses on more like a Likert scale. But no, there's no natural processing to do, natural language processing to do here. We actually do have some open-ended responses in the data, so it might be interesting to go in and do that. But yeah, I did use a computer though. So it's computational in that sense. Okay, we all good? Okay, thank you.